All right, we are continuing our study of the Gospel of John here on the Listener's Commentary. And in this recording, we are going to be looking at John 18, verses 28 through 19, verse 16. And we are really building up to the climactic moment in the Gospel of John. And so at this point in the story, in our last recording, Jesus has been arrested. He's been interrogated before Annas, who is, while not formally and officially the high priest, he's like the patriarch of the high priestly family, still has a lot of authority and influence. And so Jesus has been taken to him, interrogated before him. He's been transferred from Annas to Caiaphas. And by the time we begin this section that we're going to look at in this recording, not only has he been sent to Caiaphas, he's been tried before Caiaphas, although John doesn't recount that. For what happens before Caiaphas, we're going to have to read the other Gospels. When we arrive at 1828, it's now early in the morning, and the Jewish leaders are ready to present their charges to the Roman governor. And so we pick up at that point with Jesus being brought from the Jewish leaders to the Roman governor to present the official charges with the aim of having him executed. And so we pick up in chapter 18, verse 28, and it reads like this. Then they, that is the Jewish leadership, members of the ruling body, then they brought Jesus from Caiaphas into the Praetorium. And so we saw in our last recording how he had been transferred from Annas to Caiaphas. And we know from the other Gospels that there was a whole trial before Caiaphas. That is now over at this point in John's Gospel. And they bring him into the Praetorium. And it was early, that is early in the morning. And they themselves didn't enter the Praetorium so that they would not be defiled. That is, they would not become ritually unclean, but they might eat the Passover. A couple things we need to note by way of details. The first is the Praetorium. The Jewish leadership brings Jesus from Caiaphas's house or from wherever Jesus was tried before Caiaphas, perhaps in the official chambers of the Sanhedrin in the temple. They bring him from there into the Praetorium. And the Praetorium is the Roman governor's palace or headquarters in Jerusalem. And Pilate is the governor. We'll meet him here very shortly. And he's in town because it's festival season in Jerusalem, and he needs to be available for any disturbance of the peace. And when it says the Praetorium, there really are two options for exactly where that's located. One is the fortress of Antonia, and one is the palace that was built by Herod the Great, back before the time period of Pilate. And the fortress of Antonia is like the Roman barracks. They were actually built right up against one of the corners of the temple complex so that the Romans could have easy access to the temple as well as have an easy view of the proceedings of the temple in case anything got out of hand in the temple. That's one option. The other one is the palace that Herod the Great had built years before. And over the course of time, church tradition eventually came to favor the fortress of Antonia as the location of the Praetorium. And that's possible. But the evidence from both Josephus and Philo the Jew suggests that Pilate, when he came to Jerusalem, would stay at Herod's palace. And so a number of scholars today actually believe that's the location of the Praetorium. We're not 100% certain, and so there's some ambiguity in history. The point is, the Jewish leaders brought them from their place to the Romans' place, and the reason for that is because the Romans are the official ruling body. And the other thing to note out of that then is that they didn't enter the Praetorium. They stood outside and they had somebody go and fetch Pilate so they could present their charges. And the reason for that is they didn't want to become defiled, ritually unclean, but might eat the Passover. And the irony of that is they had just conducted a trial that actually violated a number of their own laws, and yet ritual purity is so important to them that they're not going to enter the Gentile palace on this particular occasion. And so they want to at least maintain ritual purity, but they've actually violated a number of the laws that were designed to provide justice for criminals by their official standards. And they did that because it says they might eat the Passover. Now, we need to make sure we realize that what we're talking about there is they might participate in the entire Passover season. That is, there is a ritual meal that very night that kind of kicks off the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So you have Passover. The next day, you're going to have another feast that's going to kick off the 7-day festival of unleavened bread. And that all kind of went together as Passover or as unleavened bread. By this point in time, they were referred to either way. And so they want to participate in this 7-day festival of unleavened bread that was really a center point of their ritual and religious calendar. And they don't want to be defiled because of it. So they stay outside the Praetorium with Jesus, and presumably they have some servant of Pilate go in and fetch Pilate. And so verse 29, therefore Pilate came out to them because they wouldn't go in. He comes out of the palace to them. And Pilate was the Roman governor from about 26 AD to 36 AD. And the official headquarters for the Roman government in the region of Judea was in Caesarea over on the coast. But Pilate, as we noted a moment ago, usually came to Jerusalem for festival season to help maintain peace and order. And under Roman rule, the Romans had taken the power and the right of capital punishment away from the Jews, and they themselves possessed it. So if the Jewish leaders want to eliminate Jesus, they're going to need Pilate to actually give the legal permission for him to be executed. So they bring Jesus to Pilate for that reason. That's their objective. So Pilate comes out to them and said, "What accusation are you bringing against this man?" And the Jews respond by saying, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. So you got to trust us. He really is a criminal." Now, we're going to learn very shortly that even though John just briefly summarizes this interaction, that the specific charge they give is that Jesus claims to be the Messiah, the King of the Jews. So we'll see that in Pilate's interaction with Jesus. But in summarizing this initial interaction between Pilate and the leaders, John doesn't actually point out exactly what the charge is. They just reassure him that indeed he is a criminal. So Pilate said to them, "Well, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." And we can infer in Pilate's response that they have told him he's claiming to be the Messiah. He's claiming to be the King of the Jews. And Pilate's like, "That seems like it's your issue, not mine. You take him and judge him." The Jewish leaders then said to him, "We're not permitted to put anyone to death." That's why they've brought him to Pilate, because Pilate alone, as the Roman governor, has the right to condemn a criminal to death. We're not permitted to put anyone to death. And John explains in verse 32, and this happened so that the word of Jesus, which he said, indicating by what kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Jesus had said he was going to be lifted up on a cross. Jesus said he was going to be crucified. Well, that was the Roman method for executing criminals like Jesus. And so in order for him to die by crucifixion, the Romans had to be the one to pronounce the death penalty. Well, after this little interchange between the leaders and Pilate, Pilate goes back into the palace to interrogate Jesus a bit. And so verse 33, therefore Pilate entered the Praetorium, the palace, the Roman headquarters, again, and summoned Jesus and said to him. So he brings Jesus before him and said, "You're the King of the Jews?" So notice that Pilate states the charge as Jesus being the King of the Jews, the Messiah, which is what indicates that the Jewish ruling council had passed that charge on to Pilate about Jesus. And this charge is actually at the center of the case against Jesus. In fact, all of the Gospels make it clear that Jesus' identity is the reason for his crucifixion. He's crucified for claiming to be the Messiah and the King of the Jews. Now, why would Pilate actually care about that charge? Well, there's really two main reasons. One, peace and order. This is a huge deal to the Roman authorities. They're going to maintain Roman peace and order at any cost. In fact, in Judea, where Pilate is the governor, Messianic revolutionaries were well known for stirring up all sorts of trouble and disturbing the peace. Pilate would care about this charge for that reason. Not only that, treason and loyalty. Pilate wants to make sure he's being loyal to Rome. He has to put down any threats to Roman power, any rivals to the emperor and the Roman ruling power. So treason versus loyalty also makes Pilate concerned about this charge. And so he asked Jesus, "You're the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered in verse 34, "Are you saying this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" So Jesus knows that Pilate has had an interaction with the Jewish authorities, and he's basically forcing Pilate to say, "Where did you get this idea about me being the king of the Jews?" And Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" So he's like, "Tell me what you've done that made them hand you over to me." And Jesus answered and said, "My kingdom is not of this world." So that's his initial statement. He doesn't deny the charge. He actually says he has a kingdom. So yes, I'm a king. And yes, I rule a kingdom, but my kingdom is not of this world. And then he goes on to say, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Notice, of this world, of this realm stand sort of parallel here. And what Jesus means by that is, my kingdom's not defined by this world. It's not defined by this realm. And therefore, it operates differently. That if my kingdom actually were of this world, then the way this world operates is fighting and warfare to protect me, to deliver me, to advance my cause, and to get my power. My kingdom doesn't operate that way. So Jesus affirms that he's a king and that he has a kingdom, but it's a different kind of kingdom, a kingdom that's not from this world, a kingdom that's not like this world, a kingdom that operates differently from this world. And Pilate gets the point. So look at verse 37. Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, said, "You say correctly that I'm a king." And then Jesus states in terms that would make sense to Pilate what he's really about as a king, what his objective is or his mission is as a king. So he says, "For this purpose I have been born, both to be a king, but a king with a different, unique purpose. And for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." So Jesus says, yes, I'm a king, and I've come into the world to testify to the truth, to shed light on the truth, to reveal the truth, and everyone who's of the truth, that is, who loves the truth, who submits to the truth, who wants the truth and is defined by the truth. Truth people listen to Jesus because Jesus is about the truth. Pilate, at this point, is kind of done with the conversation, and I picture him with a wave of the hand simply saying, "What is truth?" For Pilate, there really is political power, and there's political ambition, and truth is messy and confused and hard to sort out. So what is truth? Then Pilate has to go back out to where the Jewish leaders are waiting to hear the results of his investigation of the case. And so Pilate goes back out to them. After saying this, he came out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no grounds at all for the charges in his case." There's nothing here that really makes me think he deserves the death penalty. Then Pilate says, "However, you have a custom that I release one prisoner for you at the Passover. Therefore, do you wish that I release for you the King of the Jews?" So Pilate highlights this custom as a little favor to the Jews. During your high religious festival, we have this custom, this tradition where I release a prisoner to you to placate you as a little favor to you. So how about I release to you the King of the Jews? And I think there's a little bit of, jab, irony, sarcasm from Pilate towards the Jews in referring to Jesus that way. Their response to this is, verse 40, "So they shouted again, saying, 'Not this man, but Barabbas.'" Now, Barabbas was a rebel. The word rebel means an insurrectionist. It doesn't just mean, rebel rouser. It means somebody who is a true rebel against Rome, somebody who's trying to stir up insurrection. And so they ask not for Jesus to be released, but Barabbas. And we learn from Mark's gospel that Barabbas was in prison specifically in connection with revolt and murder, that he had already tried to stir up an insurrection. That's why he was in prison. And so they asked for him to be released. In other words, the Jewish leaders chose a known insurrectionist over Jesus, which just proves the hypocrisy of their charges. And not only that, there's a little irony in this guy's name, Barabbas. Barabbas means son of the Father. That's the way Jesus has been identified throughout John's gospel. He is the Son. He only does what the Father wants him to do. He's the true Son of the Father. And so Barabbas is a true rebel and revolutionary. Jesus is not. And Barabbas is a false son of the Father, and Jesus is the true one. And that's who they asked to be released. So Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And several scholars have pointed out that among the Romans at this time, there were 3 different levels of flogging: fairly light, a little bit heavier, and one that was so heavy sometimes people died from it. And a couple scholars suggest that perhaps Jesus was actually flogged twice, with this one being the first one, and thus probably being like the lightest flogging possible as a way to placate the Jews in how we see the story unfold here in John's gospel. If that's true, that would actually make sense of why the flogging here occurs at a different point in Jesus' trial than the flogging that's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so it's quite possible that Jesus was flogged here with a light flogging, and then a little bit later as a full flogging to actually prepare a criminal for crucifixion to expedite their death on the cross. So Pilate takes Jesus, has him flogged, and then we get this scene, really almost like the centerpiece of the trial, and John tells it to us in detail because it's really important to his point in telling this story. Look at verse 2 of chapter 19. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, and they placed it on his head, and they put a purple cloak on him, and they repeatedly came up to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped his face over and over again. Why does John want to give us this detail and point this out? Because it's coronation day. This is how Jesus is crowned as king. He's already been flogged, potentially with a light flogging. He's still in pain and weak. It's been a long night. And all of this, the crown of thorns, the purple cloak, all of this is intended as a mockery of his supposed royalty. But what it emphasizes is how and why Jesus was killed. Basically, this is saying, let the record of history show that Jesus was killed for being the Messiah. While they think they're mocking him, in reality, they're proclaiming the truth. Hail, King of the Jews. That's who he is. And he truly is the Messiah, and he truly is king. So all of that happened inside the palace. So Pilate once again has to come back out to the Jewish leaders. So verse 4, Pilate came out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you so that you will know that I find no grounds at all for charges in this case." And so he is basically trying to placate the Jews with what appears to be probably a light scourging or flogging, and allowing his soldiers to mock and beat Jesus a little bit, hoping that'll satisfy the Jews because he finds no reason for the death penalty here. And so they escort Jesus out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." And in a very real sense, in this moment, it's the king being presented to his people, crowned with thorns, wearing someone else's purple robe. Behold the man. So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they shouted, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no grounds for charges in this case." This is the third time Pilate has said this. I don't find any grounds for executing him. There's no grounds for crucifixion. The Jews answered Pilate and said, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." They're calling on this law of blasphemy. They don't have the right to capital punishment. So they're basically saying, look, you may not find charges, but our law says there's charges against him for death. And they say that's because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Well, that causes a surge of fear in Pilate. So look at verse 8. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Why? Well, because to his Roman ears, this put Jesus in the class of divine men. And Pilate had just had him flogged. And Pilate had just allowed his soldiers to beat and mock him. And so Pilate now is like, wait a second. Is he really the Son of God? Is he really a divine man? Then what does that mean for me since I allowed this to happen? And so he entered back into the Praetorium again, brought Jesus back in and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, are you not going to speak to me? Don't you know that I have authority to either release you or have the authority to crucify you? And Jesus replied in verse 11 and said to him, you would have no authority over me at all if it had not been given to you from above. In other words, Pilate's authority is delegated authority. God's ultimately the one in charge. Pilate only has authority in this case or any case because God has allowed Pilate to have that authority. It's delegated authority. And so you would have no authority if it wasn't given to you from above. And then Jesus says, for this reason, the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. Who's the one who handed Jesus over? Well, it's not 100% clear who Jesus is thinking of in this moment. It could be Judas, or it could be Caiaphas and the Jewish leadership. It's not perfectly clear. I lean a little bit in this specific instance to think about Caiaphas and the Jewish leadership. And I tend to think that because of what Jesus says about it. They have the greater sin. Why greater? Probably because they should know better. They have the scriptures. They are God's representatives to the Jewish nation. They ought to know better. They know far more the truth about God and the Messiah than Pilate would, and that's probably why they have the greater sin. Well, verse 12 says, as a result of this, Pilate made more efforts to release him. But the Jews shouted, saying, if you release this man, you're not a friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Essentially, they're saying Jesus is a rival king to the emperor. At least that's what he's claiming. That's the nature of the charge, right? He's claiming to be king. So if you don't oppose Jesus, well, then you're supporting treason against the emperor, Caesar himself. And Pilate, for his governorship, depends on goodwill from Caesar. So this actually puts Pilate in a difficult spot. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus back out, sat down on the official judgment seat, the Bema seat, where he pronounces official charges. So he sits down on the judgment seat at the place called the pavement, which in Hebrew is called Gabbatha. And he's going to make now the official pronouncement. John tells us in verse 14 that it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour. That verse causes a couple difficulties, so let me just point out a few things to be aware of. I included a document in chapter 13 in the study hub explaining why I think it still makes sense to understand that the meal Jesus and his disciples ate the night before this moment as a Passover meal. So how does that fit with this verse that says it's the day of preparation for the Passover? That's the question. How can it be the day of preparation for the Passover if Jesus and his disciples ate the Passover? This is one of those verses that raises that question. Was it really a Passover meal or not? Now, there are other possible explanations, and I included some of those in that document in the study hub. But I think it's best to see this not as preparation for the Passover meal, but as actually preparation for the Sabbath, that is Friday. That's the way it is in all the other Gospels. In fact, John will actually clarify that for us in just a moment. And literally, the way verse 14 reads is, it's the preparation of Passover. That's all it says. That is, it's the day of preparation during Passover. And the day of preparation for the Jews was always Friday. And this is a super special day of preparation because it's going to be a Sabbath during Passover week, and they're preparing for that. And down in verse 31, John makes it pretty explicit that that's what he means by the day of preparation. Look at verse 31 of chapter 19. It says, "Now then, since it was the day of preparation, to prevent the bodies from remaining on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high Sabbath, the Jews requested of Pilate to remove Jesus from the cross." Notice that. John makes it clear that what we're talking about is the day of preparation for the Sabbath. It's a Friday. That's what we're talking about. So we're not talking about preparation for a Passover meal. We're talking about preparation for the Sabbath during Passover week. It's the first thing to pay attention to. The other thing is, he says, it was about the 6th hour. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it says that it was about the 3rd hour. And we've noted some of the difficulties in earlier recordings with time in John's Gospel. There are some places where it's like, wait, what time factoring mechanism is John using? How is he reckoning time? Some have argued that the differences can be explained by Roman time versus Jewish time. Roman time counting from midnight, Jews counting from 6 a.m. Now, that's possible because the official Roman way of calculating things for Roman records, government records, was calculating from midnight and noon, just like we might calculate time today. That was the official way. But the popular way of reckoning time seems to have been more like from sunup to sundown. So the evidence is not 100% clear what kind of time factoring mechanism John is using in his gospel. And that means, man, we're just not totally sure what he means by the 6th hour. Are we talking about like 6 a.m.? He said a moment ago it was early. That would lend towards earlier in the morning, like 6 a.m. And so we're talking, okay, we're sometime in that first chunk of the morning, maybe. We also have to recognize that in these days, people weren't driven by the clock nearly as much as we are. They didn't calculate everything down to the minute or the hour. They tend to have more periods of the day. It was morning time. It was late morning. It was afternoon time, right? And they tended to factor that way. And so time wasn't as precise and exact. And so we're just not sure exactly what John means by the 6th hour. We know it's early in the morning. John has specified that. And so we're sometime early in the morning, whatever 6th hour means. And so it's the preparation day. It's Friday. It's early in the morning. And Pilate said to the Jews, "Look, here's your king." Again, "Behold the man, behold your king." So they shouted, "Away with him, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, remember, he's sitting on the official Bema seat where he pronounces judgment, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." And again, notice the irony and hypocrisy. In this moment, for their own gain, for their own purposes, they claim to have no loyalty to any king but the Roman king, Caesar himself. And so with that, the case is over, and Pilate decides to honor their request, and he handed Jesus over to be crucified. And what I hope you heard as we walk down through this portion of Jesus' trial is the emphasis on the kingship of Jesus. In fact, Gary Burge suggests circling or highlighting every reference to king in this snapshot. And when you do that, you see just how loudly and strongly John has placed the emphasis on this point. John is telling us Jesus is the true king. Despite what his enemies are doing to him, despite how the world has treated him, despite how he was rejected, despite how he was mocked and beaten, he is the true king, and this is his coronation day. So behold your king. What kind of king are you looking for? A king who sits in palaces like Caesar, a king who can pronounce execution on criminals like Pilate, or a king who humbles himself to be mocked and beaten, flogged and crucified on behalf of his own world for the sake of redeeming and rescuing them. Here is your king, presented to you in this snapshot, lowly, beaten, mocked, and scorned, rejected, and counted by the watching world as worthless. Jesus willingly endured this moment of shame for the sake of his subjects, for the sake of his kingdom, for the sake of his world. His kingdom is not of this world. It operates very differently. Here's the way it operates: self-sacrificial, self-giving love. Behold your king. Thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and it'll redirect you to a page through World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit, where you can set up a one-time, or you can click a little box that says Make This Monthly and set it up as a recurring monthly donation. Thanks a ton for your support.